William adjusted his tie nervously as he stood before the heavy oak door of the cottage that had been in his family for generations. The autumn wind rustled through the golden leaves overhead, creating a symphony of whispers that seemed to carry the weight of decades past. Kate stood beside him, her hand gently resting on his arm, offering silent support as they prepared to enter the home that held so many memories. The cottage had been empty for 3 years now, ever since William's grandmother, Eleanor, had passed away peacefully in her sleep. The family had been unable to bring themselves to clear out her belongings or decide what to do with the property. It sat like a time capsule, preserving moments and memories that seemed too precious to disturb. William's fingers trembled slightly as he inserted the old brass key into the lock. The mechanism turned with a familiar click that transported him instantly back to his childhood, when he would race up these same stone steps, eager to spend summer afternoons with his beloved grandmother. She had been more than just family to him. She had been his confidant, his teacher, and his greatest source of comfort during the difficult years following his parents' divorce. Kate noticed the emotion flickering across her husband's face and squeezed his arm gently. She understood the significance of this moment. They had been married for 2 years now, but this would be her first time entering the cottage that had shaped so much of William's character. He had told her countless stories about the magical summers he spent here, learning to garden from Eleanor, listening to her tales of the war years, and discovering the joy of simple pleasures like afternoon tea and homemade biscuits. The door swung open with a gentle creak, and immediately they were enveloped by the familiar scent of lavender and old books that had always defined Eleanor's home. Dust motes danced in the streams of sunlight that filtered through the lace curtains, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that made the moment feel sacred and profound. William stepped across the threshold first, his eyes immediately drawn to the sitting room where Eleanor's favorite armchair still sat by the fireplace, positioned perfectly to catch the morning light she loved so much. Her reading glasses were still folded neatly on the side table, resting atop a well-worn copy of poetry that she had been reading in her final days. Kate followed closely behind, her own eyes taking in the details that painted a picture of a life well lived. The walls were covered with photographs spanning decades, showing family gatherings, holiday celebrations, and quiet moments that had been deemed worthy of preservation. She could see William at various ages, from a gap-toothed boy of 7 to a proud teenager holding his first job certificate. The kitchen retained all of Eleanor's personal touches. Her favorite teacup, painted with tiny roses, sat beside the sink. The wooden spoon she used for stirring her famous stews was still in the ceramic holder beside the stove. Recipe cards, written in her distinctive handwriting, were tucked into a small wooden box that had been a wedding gift from William's grandfather decades earlier. William moved slowly through the rooms, each step awakening memories that had been dormant for too long. In the dining room, he paused before the china cabinet that housed Eleanor's most treasured dishes, the ones she only brought out for special occasions and holiday meals. He could almost hear her voice reminding him to be careful with the delicate teacups as he helped her set the table for Sunday lunch. Kate observed her husband's emotional journey with a mixture of compassion and fascination. She was witnessing a side of William that she had only heard about in stories. Here, surrounded by the physical remnants of his grandmother's life, she could see the boy he had once been, vulnerable and seeking comfort in the unconditional love that Eleanor had provided so freely. The second floor held even more intimate memories. Eleanor's bedroom remained exactly as she had left it, with her favorite shawl draped over the chair by the window and her journal resting on the nightstand. William had often found her writing in that journal during his visits, documenting thoughts, memories, and observations about the changing seasons and the people she loved. In the guest room where William had slept during his childhood visits, his old belongings were still carefully preserved. A wooden train set sat on the shelf, each piece positioned exactly where he had left it after his last visit as a 12-year-old. Books that Eleanor had read to him during bedtime were stacked neatly on the small desk, their pages yellowed with age, but their stories still vivid in his memory. Kate found herself particularly drawn to a small sewing room that Eleanor had used for her various crafts and hobbies. Quilting materials were organized in neat containers, and several unfinished projects suggested that Eleanor had been actively creating until very near the end of her life. A half-completed baby blanket caught Kate's attention, its soft yellow fabric decorated with tiny embroidered ducks. She wondered if Eleanor had been making it for a friend or neighbor, or perhaps hoping optimistically for future great-grandchildren. As they explored the cottage together, William began sharing stories that brought each room to life. He told Kate about the Christmas mornings when Eleanor would wake him early to watch the sunrise from the kitchen window, claiming it was the most beautiful sight in the world. He described the afternoons they spent in the garden, Eleanor teaching him the names of different flowers and explaining how to coax the best blooms from reluctant plants. The garden itself was visible through the back windows, though it had become overgrown during the years of neglect. What had once been Eleanor's pride and joy was now a tangle of weeds and wild growth. But even in its abandoned state, hints of its former glory were visible. Rose bushes that Eleanor had tended for decades still produced occasional blooms, and the old apple tree that William had climbed as a child continued to bear fruit. In the study, they discovered Eleanor's desk, its surface covered with correspondence that revealed the rich network of relationships she had maintained throughout her life. Letters from old friends, thank you notes from neighbors she had helped, and cards from family members painted a picture of a woman who had been genuinely beloved by everyone who knew her. William picked up a letter that caught his attention, recognizing his own handwriting from several years earlier. It was a thank you note he had written after one of his visits, expressing his gratitude for Eleanor's wisdom during a particularly difficult period in his life. Seeing his own words reflected back at him brought unexpected tears to his eyes, as he realized how much his grandmother had treasured even his smallest gestures of appreciation. Kate watched as her husband struggled with the overwhelming emotions that the cottage was evoking. She understood that they weren't just exploring an empty house. They were walking through the physical manifestation of unconditional love and the profound impact that one person could have on another's life. The afternoon sun was beginning to shift, casting longer shadows through the rooms and creating an atmosphere that felt both melancholy and peaceful. William and Kate had been moving through the cottage slowly, savoring each discovery and allowing themselves to fully experience the emotional weight of the moment. As they prepared to leave the cottage for the day, both knowing they would need time to process everything they had seen and felt, William paused one more time in the sitting room. He could almost see Eleanor there in her chair, looking up with the warm smile that had always made him feel like the most important person in the world. Kate understood that this visit was more than just a practical necessity of dealing with inherited property. For William, it was a pilgrimage back to the source of some of his most fundamental values and beliefs. Eleanor had taught him about kindness, patience, and the importance of paying attention to life's simple pleasures. These lessons had shaped him into the man Kate had fallen in love with, and now she was seeing their origin firsthand. The decision about what to do with the cottage would have to wait for another day. Today had been about remembering, honoring, and beginning to understand how the past could inform their future together. As they locked the door behind them, both William and Kate carried with them a deeper appreciation for the legacy of love that Eleanor had created and the responsibility they now shared to preserve and continue that legacy in their own lives. 3 weeks had passed since their first visit to Eleanor's cottage, and William found himself unable to stop thinking about the experience. During quiet moments at work, images would flash through his mind. The way the afternoon light had illuminated the sitting room, the sight of his grandmother's reading glasses waiting patiently on the side table, the overwhelming sense of presence that seemed to permeate every corner of the house. Kate had noticed the change in her husband's demeanor since their visit. He had become more contemplative, often staring out their apartment window with a distant expression that suggested his thoughts were elsewhere. She understood that the cottage had awakened something profound in him, a connection to his past that demanded attention and resolution. The decision to return came naturally, almost without discussion. They both felt drawn back to the cottage, as if their first visit had been merely an introduction to a conversation that needed to continue. This time, they came prepared to spend more time, bringing cleaning supplies and a thermos of tea, planning to begin the delicate process of sorting through Eleanor's belongings. The October weather had turned crisp and clear, with brilliant blue skies that made the countryside look like a painting. As they drove down the familiar lane leading to the cottage, William felt a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. He knew that today would likely bring more intense emotions as they moved beyond simply observing Eleanor's preserved world to actually engaging with it. Kate had spent considerable time thinking about her role in this process. She wanted to be supportive and helpful, but she also recognized that much of what they would encounter would have deep personal significance for William that she could only partially understand. Her goal was to be present and sensitive, while helping him navigate what was certain to be an emotionally challenging day. They began in the kitchen, which felt like a safe starting point. Eleanor's practical nature was evident in the way she had organized everything, making it relatively easy to sort through her belongings. Kate marveled at the collection of recipe cards, each one written in Eleanor's careful script, and many annotated with notes about family preferences or special occasions when particular dishes had been served. William found himself transported back to childhood as he handled familiar kitchen implements. The wooden spoon that Eleanor had used to stir everything from soup to cake batter still carried the faint aroma of her cooking. A set of measuring cups, dented and stained from decades of use, reminded him of the countless baking lessons Eleanor had patiently provided, teaching him that cooking was as much about love as it was about ingredients. As they worked, they discovered small treasures that revealed unexpected facets of Eleanor's personality. A drawer in the kitchen contained a collection of jokes and funny stories that she had cut from newspapers and magazines over the years. Apparently, Eleanor had maintained a sense of humor that she shared with others, as evidenced by the many notes thanked her for brightening someone's day with a well-timed joke or amusing anecdote. In the pantry, they found evidence of Eleanor's generous nature. Shelves that should have contained food for one person instead held supplies that could feed a small army. Canned goods, dried pasta, and other non-perishables were stored in quantities that suggested Eleanor had always been prepared to feed anyone who might arrive unexpectedly at her door. Kate was particularly touched by a small notebook they discovered tucked behind the flour canister. In it, Eleanor had kept track of neighbors and friends who were going through difficult times, noting birthdays, anniversaries, and other important dates. Beside each entry were reminders to herself: send flowers to Margaret for her surgery recovery, bake extra cookies for the Johnson family during their job loss. Remember to check on elderly Mr. Peterson during the cold snap. The notebook revealed a systematic approach to kindness that explained why Eleanor had been so beloved in her community. She hadn't simply responded to requests for help. She had actively sought out opportunities to make others' lives a little easier or brighter. William realized that many of his own impulses toward generosity and community service could be traced directly back to Eleanor's example. Moving to the sitting room proved more emotionally challenging. This had been Eleanor's primary living space, where she had spent her final years reading, writing letters, and watching the changing seasons through the large front window. Every object in the room seemed to carry the weight of memory and meaning. William approached his grandmother's desk with particular reverence. Eleanor had been a prolific letter writer, maintaining correspondence with friends and family members scattered across the country. The desk drawers contained carefully organized files of letters, each bundle tied with ribbon and labeled with the correspondent's name and date range. Kate watched as William pulled out a bundle labeled William, 1995 to 2018, and realized that Eleanor had saved every letter, card, and note he had ever sent her. The collection included everything from his earliest attempts at writing as a young child to recent thank you notes and holiday cards. Each piece of correspondence had been carefully preserved, creating a chronological record of their relationship that spanned more than 2 decades. Reading through his own letters to Eleanor proved to be an unexpectedly powerful experience for William. He could see his own growth and development reflected in the changing handwriting, vocabulary, and concerns that had marked different periods of his life. More importantly, he could see evidence of Eleanor's influence in the gradual sophistication of his thoughts and the increasing empathy and wisdom that characterized his later letters. One letter in particular caught his attention. Written during his university years, it detailed his struggles with choosing a career path and his fears about disappointing his family's expectations. Eleanor's response, which she had kept a copy of, revealed the gentle wisdom that had guided him through that difficult period. Rather than offering direct advice, she had shared stories from her own youth and reminded him that the most important thing was to find work that allowed him to contribute meaningfully to the world. Kate found herself equally moved by Eleanor's correspondence with others. Letters from friends revealed a woman who was sought out for advice, comfort, and celebration. Former students wrote to thank her for inspiration that had lasted long after they left her classroom. Neighbors shared their appreciation for her kindness during difficult times, and family members expressed their gratitude for her consistent support and encouragement. The afternoon brought the discovery that would prove most significant of all. While examining the contents of Eleanor's bedroom, Kate noticed that one of the floorboards near the window seemed slightly raised. When William investigated, they discovered a small space beneath the floor that contained a wooden box they had never seen before. The box was beautifully crafted, with intricate carvings that suggested it had been made by hand. Inside, they found a collection of items that appeared to represent the most treasured moments of Eleanor's life. There were photographs that hadn't been displayed elsewhere, including pictures of William's grandfather during their courtship and early marriage. A pressed flower from Eleanor's wedding bouquet was carefully preserved between sheets of tissue paper. Most surprising was a collection of letters that William's grandfather had written to Eleanor during his military service in World War II. The letters revealed a passionate romance and deep emotional connection that had sustained them through years of separation and uncertainty. Reading these intimate communications felt like being given access to a sacred part of their grandparents' relationship that had been private during their lifetimes. But the discovery that affected William most profoundly was a letter addressed to him in Eleanor's handwriting, dated just a few months before her death. The envelope was marked, "To be opened when you're ready to understand what this house really means." With trembling hands, William opened the letter and began to read Eleanor's final message to him. In her characteristic gentle but direct style, she explained that the cottage had been more than just her home. It had been her way of creating a sanctuary where love could flourish and grow. She had deliberately preserved it as a place where family members could always find comfort, wisdom, and acceptance. Eleanor's letter continued with specific instructions that surprised both William and Kate. She had arranged for the cottage to be held in trust, with William as the primary beneficiary, but with the understanding that it would be used to continue her legacy of providing comfort and support to others. She had envisioned it becoming a retreat where family members and close friends could come during difficult times, finding the same peace and restoration that William had discovered there during his childhood. The letter included practical details about a fund Eleanor had established to maintain the cottage and support its mission as a sanctuary. She had planned carefully, ensuring that financial concerns wouldn't prevent the house from serving its intended purpose. More importantly, she had outlined her vision for how the cottage could continue to be a source of healing and hope for future generations. William finished reading the letter with tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his grandmother's final gift. Eleanor hadn't just left him a house. She had entrusted him with the responsibility of continuing her life's work of spreading kindness and providing comfort to others. Kate wrapped her arms around her husband, understanding immediately the profound impact of Eleanor's request. They weren't just inheriting property. They were being asked to become stewards of a legacy that extended far beyond material possessions. As the afternoon sun began to fade, they sat together in Eleanor's sitting room, processing the revelations of the day. The cottage no longer felt like a shrine to the past. It felt like the foundation for a future that would honor Eleanor's memory while serving the ongoing needs of their family and community. William realized that his grandmother had anticipated his emotional struggle with her passing and had provided him with a way to transform grief into purpose. By asking him to continue her work of providing sanctuary and support to others, she had given him a path forward that would keep their connection alive while serving a greater good. The decision about what to do with the cottage had been made for them, but in the most beautiful way possible. Eleanor had ensured that her home would continue to be a place of love and healing, guided by the same principles that had made it so special during her lifetime. The weeks following their discovery of Eleanor's letter marked a period of profound transformation for both William and Kate. They found themselves returning to the cottage every weekend, each visit revealing new layers of Eleanor's careful planning and deep wisdom. What had initially seemed like an overwhelming responsibility gradually began to feel like a calling that perfectly aligned with their own values and desires for their future together. Kate had thrown herself into researching the practical aspects of Eleanor's vision with characteristic thoroughness. She spent hours at the local library, learning about the legal requirements for operating a retreat center and studying the financial documents that Eleanor's lawyer had provided. The fund that Eleanor had established was more substantial than they had initially realized, suggesting that she had been planning this legacy for many years. William focused his attention on the cottage itself, working to understand how the space could best serve its intended purpose. Eleanor had been remarkably prescient in her planning, having already made modifications to the cottage that would facilitate its use as a retreat. The guest bedroom had been expanded to accommodate 2 beds, and a small sitting area had been created near the window where guests could find quiet space for reflection or conversation. The garden became a particular focus of William's attention. Eleanor had always maintained that time spent in nature was essential for healing and peace of mind, and her carefully planned garden reflected this belief. Even in its overgrown state, the underlying design was still visible. Pathways that encouraged contemplative walking, secluded benches positioned to take advantage of beautiful views, and a variety of plants chosen for their therapeutic properties and seasonal beauty. As William worked to restore the garden to its former glory, he found himself connecting with memories of his grandmother in a new way. Each plant he uncovered or pathway he cleared brought back conversations they had shared about the healing power of nature and the importance of creating beautiful spaces where people could find peace. Kate discovered that she had an unexpected talent for interior design and space planning. Eleanor had left detailed notes about her vision for the cottage's use as a retreat, but she had also left room for the younger generation to add their own touches and improvements. Kate began sketching plans for subtle modifications that would enhance the cottage's function while preserving its essential character and charm. The couple's friends and family initially struggled to understand their commitment to Eleanor's vision. Some questioned whether they were taking on too much responsibility or allowing sentiment to override practical considerations. However, as William and Kate began to share more details about Eleanor's planning and their own growing enthusiasm for the project, support began to emerge from unexpected quarters. William's cousin Sarah, who was a licensed therapist, expressed immediate interest in potentially using the cottage as a venue for specialized retreats focused on grief counseling and family healing. She had been looking for a peaceful setting where clients could participate in intensive therapeutic work away from the distractions and stresses of their daily lives. Kate's sister Emma, who worked as a social worker, saw potential for the cottage to serve families in crisis who needed a temporary sanctuary while they worked through difficult challenges. She had encountered many situations where families needed a safe, supportive environment to heal and reconnect, and the cottage seemed perfectly suited to meet those needs. The local community also began to take notice of the cottage's revival. Mrs. Henderson, who lived down the lane, stopped by one afternoon to share memories of Eleanor and express her gratitude for the many ways Eleanor had supported her family over the years. She mentioned that Eleanor had often talked about her hope that the cottage would continue to serve others long after she was gone. Father Michael from the local parish visited one evening to discuss potential partnerships between the cottage retreat and the church's outreach programs. Eleanor had been a faithful member of the congregation, and Father Michael had witnessed firsthand her gift for providing comfort and guidance to people facing difficult circumstances. As spring arrived, the cottage began to bloom alongside William and Kate's understanding of their new role. The garden that William had been carefully restoring burst into life, with daffodils and crocuses pushing through the earth to announce the season's renewal. Eleanor's fruit trees, which had continued to thrive despite years of neglect, produced abundant blossoms that filled the air with sweet fragrance. The symbolism of this natural renewal was not lost on the couple. They began to see their stewardship of the cottage as part of a larger cycle of growth, decay, and rebirth that connected them to something much larger than their individual lives. Eleanor's vision was taking root in their hearts and minds, growing into something that would serve not just their family, but their entire community. Kate decided to take a leave of absence from her corporate job to focus full-time on developing the cottage retreat. The decision surprised many of her colleagues, who saw her as being on a fast track to executive leadership. However, Kate found that the work of creating something meaningful and nurturing aligned with her deepest values in a way that her previous career had never managed to achieve. William arranged to work remotely several days a week, allowing him to spend more time at the cottage while maintaining his professional responsibilities. His employer was supportive of the arrangement, particularly after William explained the community service aspect of the cottage project and how it aligned with the company's corporate social responsibility initiatives. The first official guests at the cottage retreat were William's Aunt Margaret and her teenage daughter Lisa, who had been struggling to communicate following Margaret's recent divorce. Eleanor's letter had specifically mentioned Margaret as someone who might benefit from the cottage's peaceful environment, and William felt it was appropriate that she be among the first to experience what they were creating. Margaret arrived looking exhausted and emotionally drained, clearly carrying the weight of her recent life changes. Lisa appeared sullen and withdrawn, typical of a teenager dealing with family upheaval, but intensified by the additional stress of her parents' separation. Kate and William welcomed them with the same warmth and acceptance that Eleanor had always provided, offering comfort without judgment or pressure. The transformation that occurred over their 3-day stay was remarkable to witness. Margaret found solace in the cottage's peaceful atmosphere and began to open up about her fears and hopes for the future during long conversations with Kate in Eleanor's garden. Lisa discovered Eleanor's collection of books and spent hours reading in the window seat, gradually emerging from her shell as she felt the safety and acceptance that the cottage provided. By the time Margaret and Lisa departed, both had experienced a noticeable shift in their relationship. They were communicating more openly and had begun to develop a plan for moving forward together as a family unit. Margaret expressed her amazement at how Eleanor's presence seemed to permeate the cottage, creating an environment where healing felt not just possible, but inevitable. Word of the cottage retreat began to spread through informal networks of family and friends. Each success story generated interest from others who were facing their own challenges and seeking a supportive environment for working through difficult issues. William and Kate found themselves fielding calls and emails from people who had heard about Eleanor's vision and wanted to learn more about how the cottage might be able to help them. The couple realized they needed to establish more formal procedures and guidelines for the cottage's use. Eleanor's notes provided some direction, but many practical questions needed to be addressed. How long could guests stay? What types of support would be provided? How would they ensure that the cottage remained a place of healing rather than simply a vacation destination? Working with Sarah and Emma, they developed a framework that honored Eleanor's vision while providing clear structure for the cottage's operation. Guests would be referred through a network of counselors, clergy, and social workers who could identify people who would genuinely benefit from the cottage's unique environment. Stays would typically last between 3 and 7 days, with longer arrangements possible in special circumstances. The cottage would provide comfortable accommodation, home-cooked meals prepared according to Eleanor's recipes, and access to the healing environment that Eleanor had so carefully created. Professional counseling would be available through their network of partners, but the primary focus would be on providing a safe space where people could find peace and perspective. Kate took responsibility for developing the practical aspects of hospitality, learning to cook Eleanor's favorite recipes, and mastering the art of creating a welcoming environment that balanced comfort with respect for guests' need for privacy and reflection. She discovered that she had inherited Eleanor's intuitive understanding of what people needed to feel safe and supported. William focused on maintaining the cottage's physical environment and developing relationships with potential partners and supporters in the community. He found that Eleanor's reputation for kindness had created a network of people who were eager to support the cottage's mission in whatever way they could. As summer approached, the cottage was ready to begin serving its intended purpose as a sanctuary for healing and renewal. Eleanor's vision was becoming reality through the dedication of people who had been touched by her love and inspired by her example of service to others. The first year of operating Eleanor's cottage as a sanctuary exceeded even William and Kate's most optimistic expectations. By midsummer, they had hosted 12 families and individuals, each bringing their own unique challenges and stories of pain that needed healing. The cottage seemed to work its magic on everyone who stayed there, creating an environment where emotional barriers came down and genuine healing could begin. One of their most memorable guests was James, a veteran struggling with post-traumatic stress who had been referred by Father Michael. James arrived at the cottage barely able to make eye contact and, speaking in short, clipped sentences that revealed little about his inner world. Kate and William had been uncertain about how to help someone dealing with trauma so different from anything they had previously encountered. Eleanor's wisdom proved prescient once again. Among her notes, they found detailed observations about the importance of patience and unconditional acceptance when working with people who had experienced trauma. She had written about the need to create an environment where healing could happen naturally, without pressure or expectations for rapid progress. James spent his first 2 days at the cottage simply sitting in Eleanor's garden, barely speaking to anyone but seeming to draw comfort from the peaceful environment. On the third day, he began helping William with garden maintenance, finding solace in the physical work and the rhythm of tending to growing things. By the end of his week-long stay, James was engaging in conversations about his experiences and had begun to reconnect with the person he had been before his military service. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was real and meaningful. James left the cottage with a renewed sense of hope and a plan for continuing his healing journey. Most importantly, he had experienced a week of peace and acceptance that reminded him that recovery was possible. Another significant guest was elderly Mrs. Patterson, whose adult children had been concerned about her increasing isolation following her husband's death. She arrived at the cottage reluctant and skeptical, having been essentially forced to accept help by her worried family. However, Eleanor's presence seemed to permeate the cottage in a way that spoke directly to Mrs. Patterson's grief and loneliness. Kate found Mrs. Patterson one morning sitting in Eleanor's favorite chair, tears streaming down her face as she held one of Eleanor's books. When Kate gently inquired about what was wrong, Mrs. Patterson explained that she had found comfort in reading Eleanor's margin notes, which revealed a woman who had also grappled with loss and loneliness but had found ways to create meaning and purpose despite her pain. The conversation that followed became a turning point for Mrs. Patterson. Kate shared stories about Eleanor's approach to grief and her belief that healing came through service to others. By the end of her stay, Mrs. Patterson had volunteered to help with future cottage guests, offering her skills as a seamstress to maintain linens and her experience as a former teacher to provide tutoring for any children who might visit. The cottage began to develop its own unique rhythm and community. Former guests often returned for day visits, bringing updates on their progress and offering support to current visitors. An informal network of supporters emerged, with people contributing everything from fresh vegetables from their gardens to professional services that helped keep the cottage operating smoothly. Dr. Rebecca Chun, a psychiatrist who had heard about the cottage through her professional network, visited one autumn afternoon to learn more about their approach. She was impressed by the combination of professional support and nurturing environment that William and Kate had created. Dr. Chun proposed establishing a formal partnership that would allow her to refer carefully selected patients who would benefit from the cottage's unique therapeutic environment. The partnership with Dr. Chun opened new possibilities for the cottage's impact. She began referring individuals dealing with grief, family transitions, and various forms of emotional trauma who needed intensive support in a peaceful setting. Her professional oversight ensured that guests received appropriate clinical care while benefiting from the cottage's healing atmosphere. Kate discovered that she had developed genuine skills in crisis intervention and emotional support. Working with Dr. Chun and Sarah, she began taking courses in counseling and trauma-informed care, learning techniques that enhanced her natural empathy and intuitive understanding of what people needed during difficult times. William found his calling in creating and maintaining the physical environment that made healing possible. He expanded Eleanor's garden to include additional therapeutic elements, a labyrinth for contemplative walking, a small greenhouse where guests could engage in horticultural therapy, and quiet seating areas positioned to take advantage of beautiful views and natural tranquility. The cottage's reputation began to extend beyond their immediate community. An article in the regional newspaper about their work led to inquiries from other areas, and several families traveled significant distances to experience the sanctuary that Eleanor had envisioned. Each new guest brought their own story and added to the growing legacy of healing that the cottage represented. One particularly challenging situation arose when the local family services department asked if the cottage could provide emergency housing for the Thompson family, whose home had been destroyed in a fire. The Thompsons included 2 parents, 3 young children, and a grandmother, all dealing with trauma from losing everything they owned while also facing the practical challenges of finding new housing. The cottage had never hosted such a large group, and William and Kate were initially uncertain about whether they could meet the family's needs. However, Eleanor's notes included specific instructions about adapting the space for larger families, and the trust fund she had established included provisions for emergency situations exactly like this one. The Thompson family's 2-week stay stretched the cottage's resources and tested William and Kate's abilities, but it also demonstrated the true power of Eleanor's vision. The peaceful environment helped the children process their trauma while the adults worked on practical matters like insurance claims and finding new housing. The grandmother, who had been particularly devastated by the loss of family photographs and mementos, found comfort in helping Kate with meal preparation and sharing stories about her own experiences of loss and recovery. By the time the Thompsons moved into their new home, they had not only recovered from their immediate trauma but had developed new bonds as a family unit. The shared experience of healing at the cottage had brought them closer together and given them tools for supporting each other through future challenges. The success with the Thompson family led to additional partnerships with local emergency services and social agencies. The cottage became known as a resource for families in crisis who needed more than temporary housing but less than institutional care. Eleanor's vision of providing sanctuary was expanding to serve needs she had anticipated but that William and Kate were only beginning to understand. As winter approached, they reflected on their first year of operation and marveled at how much they had learned and grown. The cottage had hosted over 30 guests, each leaving with renewed hope and concrete plans for moving forward with their lives. More importantly, William and Kate had discovered their own calling in creating and maintaining an environment where healing was not just possible, but inevitable. Eleanor's presence continued to guide them in subtle but meaningful ways. They often found themselves making decisions based on principles they had absorbed from her example, and guests frequently commented on the sense of wisdom and compassion that seemed to permeate the cottage's atmosphere. The financial sustainability of the cottage had proven less challenging than they had initially feared. Eleanor's careful planning had created a strong foundation, and the growing network of supporters had emerged naturally as people witnessed the cottage's impact. Local businesses began offering services at reduced rates. Community members volunteered time and skills, and former guests often made donations to ensure that others could benefit from the same healing they had experienced. Kate had completely transitioned away from her corporate career and found fulfillment in ways she had never imagined possible. The work was demanding and emotionally challenging, but it aligned perfectly with her values and provided a sense of purpose that her previous job had never offered. William had arranged to work remotely full-time, allowing him to dedicate most of his energy to the cottage while maintaining the income necessary to support their own household. His employer had become a supporter of the cottage's mission, occasionally providing pro bono professional services and encouraging other employees to volunteer their time and skills. As they prepared for their second year of operation, William and Kate felt confident that they were honoring Eleanor's legacy while also creating something uniquely their own. The cottage had become more than just a retreat. It had become the center of a growing community dedicated to healing, hope, and the kind of unconditional love that Eleanor had modeled throughout her life. 5 years had transformed Eleanor's cottage from a preserved memorial into a thriving sanctuary that had touched hundreds of lives. William stood at the same oak door where their journey had begun, but now he carried keys to additional buildings that had been added to accommodate the cottage's expanding mission. Kate approached from the garden, her arms full of fresh herbs that would be used in the evening meal for their current guests. The cottage itself had evolved while maintaining its essential character. Eleanor's sitting room remained exactly as she had left it, serving as a quiet retreat where guests could find solace in her books and the peaceful atmosphere she had created. However, the property now included a small conference center where workshops and group sessions could be held, guest cottages that provided privacy for families needing longer stays, and expanded gardens that offered therapeutic activities for people of all ages and abilities. William and Kate had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when someone was ready to leave the cottage and return to their regular life. They had witnessed countless moments of breakthrough and healing, each one reinforcing their belief in Eleanor's vision and their own commitment to continuing her work. Maria Santos had been one of their most challenging guests, arriving with 3 young children after escaping an abusive marriage with nothing but the clothes they were wearing. Her initial distrust of everyone and everything had made it difficult to provide the support she desperately needed. However, the cottage's atmosphere of unconditional acceptance had gradually allowed her to begin healing from years of trauma. During her 6-week stay, Maria had slowly rediscovered her own strength and capabilities. The children had thrived in the cottage's safe environment, playing in Eleanor's garden and attending the small school that had been established in partnership with the local education authority. By the time Maria was ready to move into independent housing, she had developed job skills, rebuilt her confidence, and, most importantly, learned to trust her own judgment about people and situations. Maria's transformation had been particularly meaningful for Kate, who had struggled with her own insecurities about whether she was truly qualified to help people facing such severe challenges. Watching Maria rediscover her own power and resilience had taught Kate valuable lessons about the importance of providing support without trying to control or direct the healing process. The cottage had also become a destination for people seeking to learn about Eleanor's approach to healing and community support. Social workers, counselors, and healthcare professionals regularly visited to observe their methods and adapt them for use in their own communities. A small publishing partnership had emerged to document and share Eleanor's wisdom, ensuring that her insights could benefit people far beyond the cottage's immediate reach. Dr. Chun had established a research project studying the cottage's therapeutic outcomes, documenting the long-term benefits that guests experienced after their stays. Her preliminary findings suggested that the combination of professional support and nurturing environment produced lasting improvements in mental health, family relationships, and overall life satisfaction that exceeded traditional treatment modalities. The cottage's success had attracted attention from government agencies and charitable foundations interested in supporting innovative approaches to community mental health. However, William and Kate had been careful to maintain the cottage's essential character while accepting external support. Eleanor's notes had warned about the dangers of allowing institutional pressures to compromise the personal, intimate nature of the healing environment. One of their most profound experiences had involved hosting the Morrison family after their teenage son David had attempted suicide. The family had been torn apart by guilt, fear, and their inability to understand or address David's depression. Traditional family therapy had been helpful but limited, and they had come to the cottage as a last resort before considering residential treatment for David. The cottage's environment had allowed the Morrison family to step away from the pressures and triggers of their daily life and focus entirely on healing their relationships with each other. David had found solace in working with William in the garden, discovering that physical activity and connection with nature helped manage his depression in ways that medication alone could not achieve. The parents, Robert and Susan Morrison, had used their time at the cottage to examine their own relationship and communication patterns, working with Kate and visiting counselors to develop new ways of supporting David while maintaining appropriate boundaries and expectations. The family's healing had required intensive work over several months, but the results had been transformative for all of them. David had returned to school with new coping strategies and a support system that included regular visits to the cottage. The Morrison parents had become advocates for mental health awareness in their community and had helped establish a support group for other families dealing with teenage depression and suicidal ideation. The cottage's impact extended beyond individual healing to broader community transformation. The network of former guests, volunteers, and supporters had created informal support systems that continued to provide assistance long after people's formal stays had ended. Mrs. Patterson, who had initially come to the cottage as a grieving widow, had become a beloved figure who coordinated meal delivery for new mothers, organized transportation for elderly community members, and provided companionship for anyone dealing with loneliness or isolation. James, the veteran who had found healing through garden work, had established a program that brought other veterans to the cottage for therapeutic retreats focused on outdoor activities and peer support. His own recovery had been so complete that he had trained as a counselor specializing in trauma treatment, using the cottage as a base for his practice. The cottage had also become a training ground for a new generation of helping professionals who were learning to integrate traditional therapeutic techniques with the kind of intuitive, holistic approach that Eleanor had practiced naturally. Kate had developed a formal curriculum based on Eleanor's notes and their own experiences, teaching courses on trauma-informed hospitality and therapeutic environment design. William had discovered his own gift for working with people who found traditional talk therapy insufficient or intimidating. His ability to engage guests in meaningful conversations while working together on practical projects had proven especially effective with men who struggled to express emotions directly and adolescents who were resistant to formal counseling approaches. The cottage's financial sustainability had evolved beyond Eleanor's original trust fund to include support from multiple sources. Government contracts for emergency family housing, private insurance reimbursements for therapeutic retreats, and a growing base of individual donors had created a stable foundation that allowed William and Kate to focus on their mission rather than constant fundraising concerns. However, they had remained committed to Eleanor's principle that financial considerations should never prevent someone from accessing the cottage's services. A sliding fee scale and scholarship fund ensured that people in need could benefit regardless of their ability to pay, and the cottage's reputation for effectiveness had attracted philanthropic support from people who valued investing in proven approaches to healing and community support. As William and Kate prepared to open the cottage door for another group of guests, they reflected on how profoundly their own lives had been transformed by Eleanor's legacy. They had discovered purposes and capabilities they never knew they possessed, found deep fulfillment in work that directly improved people's lives, and built a marriage that was strengthened by shared commitment to service and healing. The cottage continued to evolve and expand its impact, but its essential character remained unchanged. Eleanor's spirit of unconditional love, patient acceptance, and faith in people's capacity for healing permeated every aspect of the cottage's operation. Guests often commented that they could feel her presence in the cottage's atmosphere, providing comfort and encouragement even for people who had never known her personally. William opened the door to welcome their newest guests, a family referred by their pediatrician after their young daughter had been diagnosed with a serious chronic illness. As he watched Kate embrace the frightened parents and kneel down to introduce herself to their scared but curious children, William felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. Eleanor's vision had been realized beyond her wildest dreams, but, more importantly, her legacy of love and service continued to grow through every life that was touched by the cottage's healing environment. What had begun as a simple act of inheriting a family home had become a calling that would continue to ripple outward through generations of people who learned that healing was always possible when approached with patience, wisdom, and unconditional love. The cottage door remained open, just as Eleanor had always intended, welcoming anyone who needed sanctuary and offering hope to all who entered. William and Kate had become the guardians of something much larger than themselves, stewards of a legacy that would continue to heal and inspire long after they too had passed the responsibility to others who shared Eleanor's vision of a world where love and compassion could triumph over pain and despair.